In the summer of 1998, my friends and I, all freshly graduated from high school, decided to celebrate our newfound freedom with a week-long trip to Redwood Springs, a remote mountain town known for its scenic hiking trails and mysterious local legends. The town was small, nestled between towering peaks and dense forests that were said to be haunted by spirits of the past. It was the perfect setting for an adventurous, if not eerie, summer vacation. The journey to Redwood Springs was an eventful one. Our group consisted of 5, me, Jenna, Brian, Mark, and Sarah. Jenna was the de facto leader, always enthusiastic and ready for a challenge. Brian was the skeptic, always ready with a logical explanation for anything unusual. Mark was the joker, constantly lightening the mood, and Sarah, quiet and thoughtful, had an uncanny intuition for sensing when things were amiss. As we drove up the winding mountain roads, the dense fog that enveloped our car seemed to swallow the world around us, leaving only the narrow beam of our headlights to guide us. The deeper into the mountains we went, the more isolated we felt, the only signs of life being the occasional deer that would dart across the road, their eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. We arrived late at night at the old cabin we had rented. It was a rustic place, wooden and worn, standing alone against the backdrop of the towering trees. The cabin creaked and groaned as if protesting our intrusion, but we were too excited to care. We unloaded our things, lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and gathered around to share stories and plans for the week. That first night, as the wind howled outside and the fire cast flickering shadows across the room, Sarah suddenly grew tense. "Do you guys feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Brian asked, looking around. "It's like someone's watching us," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself. We all paused, the mood shifting. The laughter died down as we became aware of the isolation of our surroundings. The cabin felt suddenly too small, the windows too big, the darkness outside too dense. Trying to lighten the mood, Mark joked, "Maybe it's the ghost of Old Man Redwood, come to make sure we don't party too hard." We laughed, but the laughter was tinged with unease. We decided to turn in early, retreating to our separate rooms, the sound of the wind in the trees like whispers in the night. The next few days were filled with hiking and exploring. Redwood Springs was even more beautiful by day, with sunlight filtering through the towering trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. But as each day passed, a sense of unease began to grow among us. We would often feel like we were being watched, and more than once, we thought we heard footsteps following us on the trails, only to turn around and find nothing. One evening, as we sat around the campfire, a dense mist began to roll in from the woods, thick and cold. The fire sputtered and hissed as the mist enveloped us, the temperature dropping rapidly. "Let's head back inside," Jenna suggested, her voice tight. "It's getting too cold out here." We agreed, dousing the fire and retreating to the warmth of the cabin. But as we settled in, the atmosphere inside seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, the shadows deeper. We could hear the sound of the wind picking up, howling around the cabin like a mournful wail. That night, we all had trouble sleeping. The cabin creaked ominously, and several times, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps on the roof, pacing back and forth. When I mentioned it in the morning, everyone else admitted they had heard it too. "It's probably just an animal," Brian tried to reassure us, but his voice lacked conviction. The next day, we decided to visit the local museum, hoping to learn more about the history of Redwood Springs. The curator, an elderly man with a deep knowledge of the area, told us tales of the town's past, of settlers and native tribes, of peace and conflict, and of a curse said to haunt the woods. It's said that the spirits of the past linger here, he explained, his voice lowering. They are restless, disturbed by the presence of outsiders. Be respectful, be cautious. These woods do not forgive easily. His words hung heavy in the air as we left the museum, the sense of being watched more oppressive than ever. That night, back at the cabin, the true horror began. As we gathered in the living room, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The wind outside had risen to a howl, the cabin shaking with its force. Suddenly, from the darkness outside, a loud thud resonated against the door, causing us all to jump. Mark fumbled for his flashlight, casting a shaky beam towards the window. We could see nothing but our own reflections and the blackness beyond. It's just the wind, Brian tried to convince us, though his voice faltered with doubt. We huddled together, the darkness enveloping the cabin, each noise amplified to nightmarish proportions. The thumping continued, intermittent and irregular, as if something or someone was testing the strength of the walls that protected us. Let's check it out, Jenna said, her voice steady despite the palpable fear. We can't just sit here wondering. Her leadership was a thin veneer over her terror, but we rallied behind her, grabbing whatever we could use as weapons, a fireplace poker, a heavy book, a flashlight. We approached the door, the thumping growing louder as we neared. Jenna reached out, her hand trembling as she unlocked and pulled it open. The wind burst in, the cold air slapping our faces, carrying with it a foul, earthy smell. But there was nothing there, no beast, no human, no visible threat. Just the dark, whispering woods. Something's out there, Sarah whispered, her voice almost drowned out by the wind. Something's watching us. We shut the door quickly, locking it and backing away. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming, a pressure on our minds as much as on our bodies. We retreated to the living room, the darkness around us complete except for the beams of our flashlights. That's when the whispers started. Soft at first, so faint we thought we were imagining them. But they grew louder, a chorus of indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, even the air itself. What do they want? Sarah murmured, clutching her arms around herself. I don't know, but we need to stay together, Jenna said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The voices grew in intensity, forming words we couldn't understand, a language forgotten by time. The cabin felt alive, the atmosphere thick with dread. Shadows seemed to move independently of our flashlights, coiling around the edges of the room like smoke. Unable to bear the enclosure of the cabin any longer, Mark suggested, let's go outside, maybe it's better than staying in here. We hesitated, the idea of stepping into the dark woods as terrifying as the oppressive atmosphere inside. But before we could decide, the decision was made for us. The cabin shook violently, a tremor that felt as if the earth itself was rebelling. Glasses and plates crashed to the ground, and a picture frame fell from the mantel, its glass shattering. We need to get out. Brian yelled over the noise, and we rushed to the door, pushing it open and spilling out into the night. The forest was chaos, the trees swaying violently as if caught in a storm, though there was no wind now, only an eerie stillness that was even more terrifying. The ground beneath our feet felt unstable, deceptive leaves and soil hiding the roots that seemed to twist around our ankles as we ran. We didn't know where we were going, only that we needed to move, to escape the cabin and the voices and the shaking ground. We stumbled through the dark, flashlight beams crisscrossing as we helped each other over fallen logs and thick underbrush. The further we ran, the louder a singular voice became, rising above the others. It was a deep, resonant voice that spoke in English, its words clear and commanding. "Return what you have taken," it boomed through the trees, filling the air with its power. We stopped, almost in unison, hearts pounding, breaths coming in ragged gasps. None of us spoke, there was nothing to say. We hadn't taken anything, or so we thought. But then Jenna gasped, her hand going to her pocket. She slowly pulled out a small stone, an ordinary river stone she had picked up during our hike earlier that day. "I just thought it was pretty," she stammered, her eyes wide with realization. The atmosphere shifted, the forest seeming to hold its breath. Jenna held the stone out in front of her, her hand shaking. "We didn't mean to." Before she could finish, a shadow moved in the darkness, large and imposing, its form indistinct but its presence undeniable. We backed away slowly, Jenna still holding out the stone. The shadow paused, and the air vibrated with tension, the only sound Jenna's quiet sobs of fear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow receded, melting back into the forest as if it had never been. The whispers stopped, the air cleared, and for a moment, we thought it was over. But as we turned to make our way back to the cabin, a piercing scream echoed through the trees, freezing us in our tracks. The sound was primal, filled with such terror and pain that it seemed to claw at our very souls. We spun around, flashlights darting through the darkness, searching for the source. "It came from over there," Mark shouted, pointing towards a denser part of the forest. Without thinking, we rushed towards the sound, driven by a mix of fear and the need to help, if help was still possible. The underbrush grew thicker, grabbing at our clothes and skin, as if the forest itself was trying to hinder our progress. As we pushed through a particularly dense thicket, we stumbled upon a small clearing. The moonlight, breaking through the canopy above, revealed a chilling scene. A large, ancient-looking tree stood at the center, its bark gnarled and twisted, branches hanging low, almost touching the ground. From one of these branches, a figure was suspended, swaying slightly in the gentle breeze. It was a mannequin, dressed in tattered clothes, its face featureless, but the effect was no less horrifying. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this place?" "It's a warning," Brian said, his eyes scanning the clearing. "We need to leave, now." But before we could move, the ground beneath us began to tremor. It started as a gentle shaking but quickly grew in intensity, throwing us off balance. The earth groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from below, as if something was trying to break free. From the base of the tree, the soil shifted, and roots began to writhe and twist, unearthing themselves. They moved like serpents, thick and sinewy, and as we watched, horrified, they formed a circle around us, trapping us in the clearing. "We have to get out of this," Jenna yelled, panic rising in her voice. We tried to find a gap, a way to break through the root barrier, but they were too thick, too strong. And then, the mannequin began to move. It was subtle at first, a slight twitching of limbs, but then its head turned, slowly, inexorably, until it was facing us. Its face, previously smooth and blank, began to contort, features pushing out from within, forming a grotesque semblance of a human face. Eyes, dark and bottomless, stared at us, and a mouth, wide and gaping, opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. The roots continued to dance around us, tightening their grip on the clearing. The tree itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its bark splitting to reveal glimpses of something underneath, something alive. "We need to give it back," Sarah said, her voice a mix of fear and resolve. The stone, Jenner, give it back. Jenner, still holding the stone, nodded. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she moved forward, stepping closer to the tree. With a trembling hand, she reached out, placing the stone at the base of the tree, right where the roots were thickest. For a moment, nothing happened. The roots continued to wriggle, the mannequin continued to stare, and the tree continued to pulse. Then, slowly, the tremors subsided. The roots began to retract, slithering back into the ground, and the face on the mannequin smoothed over, returning to its blank state. We didn't wait to see what else might happen. As soon as the path was clear, we ran. We ran through the woods, not stopping, not looking back, driven by a primal urge to escape, to survive. The cabin was in sight now, its windows dark, the door hanging open as we had left it. We didn't speak as we entered, each of us collapsing onto the nearest surface, breathless, exhausted, and terrified. "We can't stay here," Mark said after a long silence. "Not after this. We need to leave as soon as it's light." Nobody disagreed. We spent the rest of the night in tense silence, jumping at every sound, every creak of the cabin. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, we packed our things, our movements quick, desperate. As we loaded the car, the forest seemed normal, the trees still, the air clear. But the memory of last night hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence that watched us as we hurried to leave. We drove away from Redwood Springs, away from the nightmares and the darkness. But even as we left, I could feel it, a shadow at the edge of my mind, a whisper in the depths of my soul, reminding me that some places are better left unvisited, some secrets better left undiscovered. And as the town disappeared behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that what we experienced was only the beginning. The road stretched out in front of us, each mile putting distance between us and the horrors of the forest, but the deeper we drove into the familiar terrain of civilization, the more unsettled I felt. It was as if we were leaving a part of ourselves behind, pieces tainted by the terror and darkness we had encountered. As the hours passed, the silence in the car grew oppressive. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events that had unfolded. The haunting image of the mannequin, the writhing roots, and the disembodied whispers created a tapestry of nightmares that none of us could escape. We stopped for gas at a small, run-down station just outside another town. The normalcy of the scene, people going about their daily lives, oblivious to the darkness that lurked just hours away, felt surreal. As I stretched my legs, the crisp air felt like a slap to my face, a reminder that life continued despite the darkness we had witnessed. Inside the convenience store, while paying for the gas, I overheard snippets of conversation from the locals. They spoke of strange happenings, of pets disappearing, of shadows that moved with no bearer, and of a chill that had settled over the area since the last full moon. Their words sent a shiver down my spine, a recognition that what we had experienced was not confined to the boundaries of Redwood Springs. Back in the car, I shared what I had heard. "Guys, I think what happened to us, it's happening elsewhere. Something's spreading." Jenna, who had been quietly staring out the window, turned to look at me. Her eyes were haunted, shadows beneath them that had not been there a week ago. What if we didn't stop it? What if we only made things worse? No one had an answer. The weight of her words hung in the car like a spectre, chilling and undeniable. We drove in silence for a while longer until Sarah, who had been navigating, announced that we had taken a wrong turn and were heading back towards the mountains. Panic fluttered in my chest as she fumbled with the map, her fingers trembling. "Turn around," Brian said firmly. "We're not going back there." But as we looked for a place to make a U-turn, the sky darkened ominously, clouds rolling in so quickly they seemed unnatural. The wind picked up, howling around the car, and a heavy mist began to descend, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The road became slippery, the car's headlights barely cutting through the gloom. "We need to find shelter," Mark said, his voice strained. "We can't drive in this." Just then, a dim light appeared through the mist. As we approached, it resolved into a small inn, its sign swinging wildly in the wind. With no other options, we pulled in. The inn was old, the wood creaking ominously as the wind battered against it, but it was a shelter from the storm. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, watched us as we entered, her gaze lingering a little too long, as if she could see the fear that clung to us like a second skin. "Storm came up quick," she remarked, her voice a raspy whisper. "Rooms are upstairs. Dinner at 7. We thanked her, relief mingling with unease as we took our keys and headed to our rooms. The inn was strangely quiet, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards under our feet and the wind against the windows. As I unpacked, the feeling of being watched crept over me. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows. But I was alone, or at least, I appeared to be. Dinner was a quiet affair. The innkeeper served us a hearty meal, but ate nothing herself, just watched us with those keen, too knowing eyes. As we ate, the wind seemed to grow louder, the inn groaning under its force. "It's just a storm," Jenna said, though her voice lacked conviction. After dinner, we gathered in the common room, the fire crackling in the hearth providing some comfort against the howling wind outside. But as the night deepened, the feeling of dread grew. The inn seemed to settle around us, the walls whispering secrets in a language we could not understand. And then, the lights flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, the fire seemed to roar, casting dancing shadows across the room. A cold draft swept through the inn, and with it, a whisper, a voice that was not a voice, saying a single, chilling word: "Return." We huddled closer to the fire, the darkness oppressive, the whispers growing louder. It was clear now that our ordeal was far from over. The horrors of Redwood Springs had followed us, or perhaps we had never left them behind at all. The boundaries between our past terror and our present fear blurred as the inn around us seemed to pulsate with an unseen heartbeat. The whisper that had cut through the darkness continued to echo in our ears, its syllables twisting around the edges of our sanity. "Return," it insisted, a demand, a plea, a curse. The firelight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls, shadows that seemed almost human in their jerky, tortured movements. "Maybe it wants the stone," Sarah murmured, her voice a ghostly whisper over the crackling of the fire. "Maybe we never should have taken it from the cabin." "But we left it there, at the tree," Jenna responded, her eyes wide as she stared into the flames, as if seeking answers in their chaotic dance. The wind outside howled with renewed vigor, as if angered by our confusion and fear. The inn creaked ominously, wood groaning under the invisible weight of the storm, or perhaps something far more sinister. "We need to figure out what it wants," Brian said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't keep running, and we can't return to Redwood Springs. Not now." As if in response to his words, a loud thump echoed through the inn, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor upstairs. We all froze, our breaths held in a collective gasp of fear. "It's here," Mark whispered, terror evident in his tone. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the upper floor to the other. It was as if something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the wooden planks. Without a word, we all stood, a silent agreement forming among us. We needed to confront whatever haunted us, to end this nightmare once and for all. Gathering whatever makeshift weapons we could find, fireplace pokers, a heavy candlestick, a sturdy piece of firewood, we prepared to ascend the stairs. The staircase creaked under our weight, each step a nerve-wracking symphony of old wood and rising terror. The scraping sound grew louder as we approached the second floor, the air growing colder with each step. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before us, dimly lit by the moonlight that filtered through dusk-coat windows. The doors to the guest room stood ajar, swaying slightly as if caught in a gentle breeze, though the air was deathly still. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by a silence that was almost more terrifying. We moved slowly down the hallway, our makeshift weapons held before us like shields against the darkness. As we passed the first room, Jenna suddenly stopped, her body rigid. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We all turned to look. At the end of the hallway, a shadow stood, tall and imposing. It was too dark to make out any features, but its presence was undeniable, a darkness against darkness, a void where light seemed to fear to tread. The shadow did not move, did not make a sound, but we could all feel its eyes on us, a palpable weight that seemed to press against our very souls. "What do you want from us?" Jenna called out, her voice stronger now, tinged with anger and defiance. The shadow shifted, a slight movement that sent a shiver down our spines. And then, it spoke, its voice a chilling blend of whispers and wind. "Return what was taken," it said, the words echoing down the hallway, through the inn, through our very bones. "We don't have it," Brian replied, stepping forward. "We left you a stone. We left everything." The shadow paused, as if considering his words. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve, the darkness dissipating like mist in the morning sun. But as it faded, it whispered one last word, a word that froze our hearts. "Find it." The air lightened slightly as the presence receded, leaving us alone in the hallway, our breaths echoing loudly in the sudden silence. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice a mere whisper. "We find whatever it is we're supposed to return," Mark answered, determination settling over his features like a mask. "We find it, and we end this." We descended the stairs, a new purpose fueling our steps. The storm outside had lessened, the wind no longer howling with fury, but the night was still dark, the moon obscured by lingering clouds. As we gathered in the common room, the plan was hastily formed. We would return to Redwood Springs, search the cabin, search the woods. Somewhere in that haunted wilderness was the key to our salvation, a way to appease the spirits we had so unwittingly disturbed. The night passed in restless anticipation, each noise, each creak a reminder of the presence that had visited us. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we packed our belongings with a silent urgency. The innkeeper watched us from the shadows, her gaze piercing yet unreadable. With a final nod, we loaded our car and set out, the rising sun casting long shadows across the road that led back to Redwood Springs. The drive was tense, each mile bringing us closer to the source of our nightmares. As we approached the familiar terrain surrounding the town, a palpable sense of dread settled over us. The once welcoming landscape now seemed hostile, the trees like silent sentinels watching our return. We reached the cabin by mid-morning, the building appearing just as foreboding as we remembered. The air was still, the usual sounds of wildlife eerily absent. We entered cautiously, the door creaking ominously on its hinges as we stepped inside. The cabin was untouched since our hasty departure, our belongings scattered where we had left them in our flight. "We need to search everywhere," Jenna said, her voice low. "Anything could be what it's looking for." We split up, each taking a section of the cabin. Drawers were pulled open, cushions were overturned, and every book and crevice was checked. Yet, nothing unusual appeared, no hidden relics or forgotten artifacts that could be the object of such terror. Frustrated and anxious, we reconvened in the living room. "There's nothing here," Sarah said, disappointment heavy in her voice. "What are we missing?" "It has to be something from the forest," Mark suggested. "Maybe it's not about what we took but about what we disturbed." With a collective sense of resolve, we headed back into the forest, the place where our nightmare had begun. The woods felt alive, the trees whispering secrets in the wind, leaves rustling as if speaking in hushed tones. We retraced our steps to the ancient tree, its gnarled form casting a long shadow over the ground. As we approached, the air grew colder, the atmosphere charged with an unseen energy. At the base of the tree, where Jenner had placed the stone, the earth was disturbed, as though something had been recently unearthed. "Here," Brian said, kneeling. His hands dug into the soil, fingers searching until they brushed against something hard. He pulled out a small, intricately carved box, no bigger than a book. It was old, the wood worn smooth by time, and it hummed with a palpable energy. "This must be it," Jenna said, a mix of awe and fear in her voice. "We should open it," Sarah suggested, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "No," I interrupted, the sense of dread overwhelming. It returned, not opened. "We need to bury it again, show respect." Without another word, Brian replaced the box, burying it carefully under the earth at the base of the tree. We all stood back, a silent vigil as the sun reached its zenith, casting light through the canopy. A deep, resonant sigh seemed to echo through the forest, a sound of release, of relief. The air lightened, the oppressive atmosphere lifting in an almost palpable wave. We stood in silence, each of us feeling the change, the end of our ordeal palpable in the air. As we left the forest, the sounds of life returned around us, birds singing and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. The forest, once a place of dread, now seemed to acknowledge our departure with a serene acceptance. Our drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts, processing the events that had bound us together in such an unexpected and terrifying way. Redwood Springs faded into the distance, becoming just another part of the landscape, its secrets buried once again. We returned to our lives, forever changed by our experience. The horrors we faced would linger in our memories, shadows in the corners of our minds. But there was also a sense of closure, a story completed, its final chapter written in the roots of an ancient tree and sealed with respect for the unknown and unseen. Our summer vacation was over, the kind of trip that no one would believe if we told them. But among us, it was a shared truth, a bond forged in fear and solidified in survival. We had faced the dark side of nature, of history, and of ourselves, and we had emerged, not unscattered, but together. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the sharp edges of our terror began to dull, softened by the routines of our everyday lives. Yet, none of us could shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during that harrowing summer. The world seemed a little less predictable, a little more filled with unseen depths and shadows where secrets lay buried. Occasionally, we would gather, drawn together by an unspoken need to share the company of those who understood. During these meetings, the conversation would inevitably circle back to Redwood Springs, to the ancient tree, and to the mysterious box we had reburied. Each of us had been touched by the darkness of that place in different ways, marked invisibly but indelibly. Jenna, who had always been the most adventurous of us, had grown more introspective, her once bright laughter now tempered with a cautious edge. Brian threw himself into his studies, focusing on folklore and the supernatural, perhaps in an attempt to rationalize what we had experienced. Mark, the Joker, had lost some of his irreverence, his jokes now tinged with a darker humor. Sarah, ever sensitive, seemed to carry an extra weight, her eyes often distant and thoughtful. As for me, I found solace in writing, pouring our story onto the page, trying to make sense of it, to give it shape and containment. But some nights, as I sat alone with my thoughts, the keyboard silent before me, I would feel the chill of the forest's breath on my neck, and the whispers would return, faint and indistinct, as if carried on the wind from far away. It was during one of our reunions, nearly a year after our trip, that we decided to return to Redwood Springs. Not out of a desire to rekindle our fears, but to lay them to rest, to perhaps find some closure. We needed to see the place in the light of day, removed from the shadow of our memories. The drive was quiet, each of us lost in our anticipations and dreads. When we arrived, the town was just as we remembered, sleepy and innocuous, belying the darkness that we knew lurked in the woods. We made our way to the cabin first, finding it just as we had left it, though it seemed smaller now, less menacing. From there, we walked to the clearing, to the ancient tree. It stood as we remembered it, massive and imposing, but it was just a tree, no longer animated by the malevolent energy we had felt before. Brian, who had brought a small spade, knelt and gently dug at the base of the tree, where we had reburied the box. The earth turned easily under his hands, and soon, he had uncovered it again. We all gathered around, staring at the box with a mixture of fear and fascination. Should we open it? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. After a moment of hesitation, Jenna nodded. Yes. We need to know. We need to understand. With trembling hands, Brian lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but a small pile of dirt and a single acorn, which seemed to pulse with a faint, warm light. It's an offering, Brian said, realization dawning in his voice. A symbol of renewal, of life continuing and renewing itself. We all took a deep breath, the tension easing from our shoulders. The mystery had not been what we expected, but it was an answer of a sort, a message from the forest itself. We reburied the box, this time leaving the acorn inside. As we did, the air around us seemed to lighten, the forest acknowledging our understanding, our respect. As we left Redwood Springs for the last time, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. But the shadows were just shadows now, nothing more. The drive home was lighter, filled with conversation and laughter, the bond between us stronger and more profound. We had faced our fears, had stared into the darkness, and had found not only answers but also a deeper appreciation for the mysteries of the world around us. That summer vacation, as harrowing as it had been, taught us about the strength found in friendship, the importance of respect for the past, and the power of facing the unknown. And though we would carry the echoes of those dark days with us forever, we also carried the light of understanding, a light that would guide us through whatever shadows we might face in the future.